Hello everybody, welcome to The Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today it's time for Some Stuff I Missed, in which I go down some stuff I missed. Not all the stuff I missed, but some of it. You know, the past couple of years I've done 3 of these roundups in each year, but if the escalating size of last year's roundups are any indication, going forward I may need to do these on a quarterly basis instead. Not that I didn't have a lot of fun with the last volume covering 42 projects in a single 2-hour video, and somehow I didn't come out of the end of that one burned out on these either. But I did nearly run out of room in terms of, the character limit for YouTube's video descriptions, and that seems like a sign I ought to exercise a tiny bit more restraint. But hey, maybe doing one more in a year means they'll be slightly shorter and more approachable as a result, who knows? Or not, since this one is not going to be shorter than what has become the norm, as I have another 32 releases on the docket. 7 of those are left over from last year, and 4 of those EPs, and of course there's a lot of random Bandcamp diving, as I think you'd probably expect at this point. But there's also plenty of quality to be found as per usual. I think we know the drill by now. Don't feel like you need to watch the whole thing in one sitting if you don't want to, but I do always make sure these roundups are front-to-back entertaining and can be easily digested all at once for anyone who feels like it. If nothing else, even if you don't sit through all of it, I do hope you might click through a bunch of these names that you don't recognize in case they end up sticking with you and you end up discovering an overlooked gem. Maybe click on one of the many 7-range projects I've highlighted in case that ends up clicking on an even deeper level for you. And of course, if you want to know my favorite and least favorite tracks in a given release covered here, you can click the link to a pastebin document that will be in the description as well. But let's not waste any more time. I'm going to kick things off with a bunch of projects that came out last year, starting off with, from Ceephax Acid Crew, Baddow Moods. Alright, we're starting off with a more familiar face. Andy Jenkinson decided to jump in at the last possible moment of 2022 and drop an entire proper album on Christmas. Just barely enough time for me to hear it and give it the quickest of acknowledgements in my year-end list. But if you're wondering whether it's still worth going back to, the answer is yes. This is a predictably very solid collection of lengthy but grooving melodic deep house arrangements. Not quite as punchy as 2021's Box Steady, and definitely a bit more on the chill side like older albums of his like Cro-Magnox and Camelot Arcade were. Hence the album technically being labeled merely by Ceephax without the Acid Crew part of the name on Bandcamp, despite what the album cover says. But all the same mood-lifting qualities and spot-on groove construction that were on his last album are still here as well, and it's still lots of fun. I will say much of the first leg of the album didn't really give me much to say. Tracks like Escalator Love, Ventilaris, and Telefax all had really solid deep house grooves with nice, chill, and emotionally resonant melodies. All really freaking good stuff that pulls me in really nicely, and the latter cut has some synth blips that remind me of the Metamatics track No Condiments. Although these tracks are fundamentally the same kind of idea, as are later cuts like Steinmetz, which I suppose does have a bit more of a playful edge than most of these other cuts, but didn't really stick out to me or pull me in as much as some of these others. But the standouts on this thing are a total knockout. Where the album really picks up for me is Strut Storm Mix, which has all these deep bass rumbles and echoing MIDI pianos adding up to exactly as stormy a mix as the title implies. That track was excellent, and I ended up highlighting that one as a standout individual track on my year-end list. And he starts to deliver even more intriguing ideas after that point, whether it be the super dramatic ambient arpeggio clouds of Way Station, the 9-minute journey through understated grooving subtlety on Leasty, the darker and stormier and more dissonant approach to Lost Ranger, the understated little solo electric piano cut in Haven, and the emotional penultimate cut in functional closer Roddy, which almost sounds like an 80s power ballad filtered through the Dire Dire Docks theme from Super Mario 64. Not every cut on here may stand out as much as the next, and some may be a bit background music-y, but even the least memorable moments here are going to have you vibing right along with them and getting into their grooves and melodies really easily, and the best moments easily make it worth the price of admission. It may not be a home run on the level of Box Steady, I stand by that being his best album to date, but it's absolutely another quality entry into his catalog that will please any of his longtime fans, or any fans of this blend of moody deep house. Even some of his most understated material can effortlessly put a smile on my face, so do make sure to check this out if you missed it. This gets a very strong 7.7 out of 10. Next up, from Apostrophe, A Hypothesis. This was the last Bandcamp Daily Rec that I managed to hear right before 2022 closed out. It literally came out on December 18th. Ostensibly, this is a straight ambient record, but combining that style with jazz and soundtrack music to really neat effect, giving you light and monolithic drones and breaking them up with dramatic and emotional piano performances, as well as including plenty of other instrumentation like strings and clarinets and saxophones and bells, occasionally a little bit of light drumming too, and it's some really freaking good emotionally resonant stuff. Highlights include the dramatic opener Hypnopaedia, with its chilling pads and punctuated pianos building up to really nice effect and perfectly sets the tone for the project. The strikingly sad sax and cello solos going over the cloudy pads of Black Rain, the chiming bells going up next to slow jazzy drumming and clarinets on A Lullaby, the more experimental dark ambience of Ethical Fading and its more processed and fuzzy electronic approach. And the track that I ended up highlighting in my 2022 year-end list was Apnea, which delivers this absolutely gorgeous blend of descending bell melodies and tense minor key woodwind choruses. Itself a track which sees its themes built upon quite effectively on the 8-minute penultimate track Periplus. And I wouldn't say there are any bad or skippable tracks here, maybe some I'm less into than others for not being as well textured, like how monotonous in E minor or the closer bittersweet endings fall back on more straightforward piano performances, but they're still very nice. And there's also the track Winter of 22-23, which was mostly a single chilling ambient drone that I wish had a bit more to it. There does exist a 23-minute version of this cut which he released separately that I think very much alleviates this issue, though the album edit of this cut would still probably be the one I'd arbitrarily mark as the least favorite among these compositions. Still, this is some stellar work. He's already seen a decent amount of attention off its promise, and I think he deserves even more. Also, if you wanted a timelier recommendation from him, he's already put out even more work in 2023. Stay tuned for later in this roundup for a bit of that. But in the meantime, yeah, I thought this was great. This guy managed to sneak in a real gem right at the end of the year. I'm overall feeling a solid 8 out of 10 on it. Next up from Boxplot, Here and Now. Okay, this was a project that came out all the way back in May of last year, but I just randomly found as a recommendation in the middle of the comment section of my year-end list somewhere. Someone said it was their favorite album of the whole year, and I thought, man, this is some random artist I've never heard before. Let's see if I end up getting into it as well and figure out how much I'm missing here. Turns out, yeah, I was missing out, alright. This is some really freaking good melodic drum and bass. A few volumes ago, I covered a liquid drum and bass album by Bachelors of Science, and this is kind of along similar lines, in that it mostly sticks to a tried and true set of formulas that, while very well executed, is probably not going to blow anyone's mind in the greater context of that genre. But combine those guys' straightforward drum and bass sound with the hyper-earnest sentimentality of Porter Robinson's Nurture, along with some of his indie rock influences, and that's more or less what Boxplot delivers here. I got right away how this could end up as someone's album of the year, right from when the album first started with an 11-minute behemoth in Human Again that evolved from heartfelt ambience to banging drum and bass and back. I figured I'd be in for something good. But it was the second track, Always Here My Dear, that really pulled me in as I felt the beats went even harder, and there were these really bright lead synth lines that being placed over the top that reminded me a lot of Zircon in the best possible way. And from there, Boxplot made sure to keep things interesting. While cuts like Open Arms and It's Wobbling Filter Drop or Why Try with its airy vocal samples could add to the overall variety of the project, I honestly found myself gravitating the most towards the most straightforward cuts here that sounded like they were bridging the gap between like Pendulum's Immersion and Eco's Wolves. Tracks like Heartstrings, I Think Too Much, and Speaking in Tongues with their thunderous bass and melodic synths and guitar blasting going ridiculously hard. Also, Only Us, who features an uncredited female guest vocalist who knocks her performance out of the park. I did maybe think the album didn't end as strongly as it started. The last two tracks, Leaving and Welcome Home, hit in all the same ways as my favorite tracks here could, but didn't really have anything that could really set themselves apart as standouts. And there were a couple of interludes that didn't really add anything substantial either. But lack of innovation aside, this is still a great freaking listen that has so many soaring emotional moments that still all hit really well, and so many visceral drum and bass grooves that absolutely slap. If you missed it before like I did, it's definitely worth coming back to and seeking out. I'm overall feeling a solid 8 out of 10 on it. Next up from Caterina Barbieri, Spirit Exit. This This was a project that I had actually come across around the time it came out, way back in this past July. I think I saw it in the new music section of iTunes and considered putting it in one of these roundups, but ended up falling towards other projects that were either more striking to me or were getting less attention. And it wasn't until Oliver from Deep Cuts highlighted it in his year-end list that I decided I should really go back and check this out. And, I mean, I do quite enjoy it, as everyone else seems to be. On one hand, Barbieri does explore a pretty unique style in her brand of long-winded modular synth excursions. Lots of warm and heartfelt but pained and desperate-sounding melodies coming through some harsher synth textures that remind me of artists like Corliss. Also combining that with a little bit of her own vocals as background texture, which leads to this album feeling like a much more straightforward mirror to that Caitlin Aurelia Smith album, which I highlighted in my year-end list. The trouble with this project is that as nice as the core style and sound of it is, there's pretty much nothing in the way of variety. Its 8 tracks are fundamentally exactly the same. Some get a bit harsher, some are a bit more chill, some include vocals, some don't, some try to progress a little more, though most don't progress that much. The whole album feels like a single meandering jam session, and there's very little for me to break down here, leading to a listen that, while I enjoyed having it on in the background, I didn't really find myself connecting with it beyond the surface level. I can certainly respect this project for what it is and for the emotion put into these winding pieces, and hey, it's obviously resonated a lot more deeply for tons of other people, so maybe it'll still be worth giving a shot for you. I'm definitely going against the grain on my mostly lukewarm feelings, but yeah, I personally only think it's nice, if not all that special, so yeah, I'm feeling a strong like 6.7 out of 10 on it. Next up from Tettix, Hexer, Aero. But while we're on the topic of big emotional walls of sound and harsh modular synth excursions, this is a bit of a similar project from this past November that I saw recommended to me a few times in my comments, as being something kind of mildly adjacent to the upscale scene. Funny enough, this album is actually pretty close in approach and sound to that Caterina Barbieri album I just got finished talking about. A lot of the harsher synth textures and melodies it explores sound very similar, and it even incorporates background vocals in a similar way. Although this is much more tightly structured and controlled, not nearly as meditative and winding, and featuring a lot more intense glitch work and influence from shoegaze and indie rock stylings, putting this much closer to the likes of Alexander Panos' Nascent and Jerome's It's Hard to See Color When You're Impossibly Far Away. And I enjoyed this album on roughly the same level as I did those two projects. So that does mean I don't absolutely love it. I could admittedly find the listening experience to be a bit overbearing in points and occasionally a bit hit and miss, but that's certainly not to say I didn't get plenty out of this stuff anyway. This thing starts out really strong with the first 2 tracks. The intro Spirit Engineer hits you with all these really pretty MIDI pianos and bursts of melody, and the second track, Goodbye, rushes past with so many different frantic glitches and loads of synth notes and vocal chops flying past you at high speed, until it all culminates in this amazing cloud of soaring melodic noise. And they do set the tone for the level of intensity you'll get throughout the album, although I think the only other track to match the quality of these first 2 cuts might be Gemstone Bleeder Burning in the Ether, which is this sprawling 8-minute opus featuring a particularly solid core tune and some nice processed indie vocals. This really nice stuff. And there are other tracks that come close to that quality. I do really like the tune behind Ascension Echo, and I really like how chaotic and complex the closer Aero host gets. And there are a couple of longer 7-minute tracks that I was hoping to say I liked as much as Gemstone Bleeder, but I'm not sure if they hit on quite the same level for me. Free the Aero Horses, Let Them Run Far and Wild is nice enough and has a cool outro, but maybe left me feeling like it didn't entirely need to run on as long as it did. And Typojin had the potential to be my favorite track in the bunch with how excellent the opening stretches of more MIDI pianos and melodic breakdowns were. But this track gets completely ruined by this super on-the-nose text-to-speech voice wondering when the drop is going to hit and end up turning into like a running narration of what the track you're listening to sounds like, combined with the producer's insecurities about his techno skills. Yeah, no. Please just let the music speak for itself, man. The self-deprecation is only openly getting in the way. Aside from that, though, this album does have a high floor, and even some of the less memorable cuts like Supernova in Your Eyes and the bevy of interludes are not skips for me. It's an entirely serviceable project with a particularly unique sound and a lot of emotion poured into it. It's not a retrospective year-end list contender, but it is very solid, and the best moments make it worth the price of admission. I definitely say it's worth checking out if you've missed it, so I think I'll give it a 7.5 out of 10. Next up, from Ryoji Ikeda, Ultratronics.
Count. 1, 2, 3.
Oh boy, now this was a big one. Ryoji Ikeda is a fairly legendary Japanese experimental artist and composer who's been at it since the mid-90s, a notable pioneer in the worlds of glitch and microsound, gaining a slightly wider audience through releasing on labels like Raster Noton, alongside the likes of Alvanoto and Ryuichi Sakamoto, or on the label Touch, alongside artists like Biosphere. I've gotten a couple of requests to check his stuff out over the years, and was specifically reminded about him after my recent Q&A video, and wouldn't you know it, he happened to release an entire new studio album just this past December, so I threw it in here. At first I just planned to cover the new album on its own, but I decided to heck with it, I'll give him a mini and brief segment as well and check out his old albums to further educate myself. It's not like he releases often enough where I'd get another easy chance to do it. Specifically, just gonna go through his solo studio albums that are currently available on streaming services, of which there are 8 in total, so here's my quick thoughts on those. A collection of 3 multi-section conceptual pieces, one that's kind of a scattered sound collage, one that collects some spooky and extremely minimal dark ambience, and one much lighter minimal ambient piece with some modern classical influences. I fuck with it. An even more minimalistic glitch and drone study made out of pretty much nothing but very simple tone generator sounds and a little bit of brittle electronic percussion. It almost starts to border on the non-musical in parts, though it never actually enters into that territory and still retains a clear sense of structure and progression over time. More the same kind of stuff as the last 2 albums, glitchy sound collage, tone generators, minimal ambience, etc. Next up, a double album. The first disc is exactly an hour of nothing but solo single-tone sine wave drones with very mild phase-shifting filters, and that's literally it. If you listen to it via speakers, your movement around the room apparently alters how the isolated sound waves interact with each other, though given I'm exclusively a headphone listener, that concept didn't quite translate. Might still find its place for some people anyway, I don't know. And the second disc is markedly more dynamic, adding in more textures and glitches and effects, even if aesthetically just as barren, and I guess it's solid. Oh, but now we got a full-on modern classical album, compositionally just as minimalistic as ever, but these discordant high-pitched ambient pads are now being played on strings instead of synths. Not exactly the most interesting stuff I've heard in this vein, but again, it is quite nice. But this is the album that people have most commonly recommended to me in the past and was highlighted as his best work, and you know what, I can pretty much confirm the hype behind it. This was actually the first project of his I heard in this marathon, but it turned out to be a good starting point, focusing on his typical style of minimalistic glitches and high-pitched micro sound, but presented in a way that was much better paced and changed and evolved a lot more over time. Felt a lot better layered and textured. It is a great project. Kinda like the last project again, but slightly more stripped back, a bit more buzzing electro influences, and less memorable. Also kinda like the last project again, though I think this one's a bit more aggressive, and I enjoyed it more in a bit of an unspecific way. A few cuts here do particularly slap. Which brings us to here. Now, I'll freely admit that Ikeda's music on a baseline level isn't always my thing. Some of his stuff can make Outer look accessible, especially given how often he works with higher frequency noises and basic tone generators. There have definitely been albums where I would have, like, mild tinnitus ringing at the end and mistake it as part of the album itself. Though, to be fair, his use of high frequencies tends to be relatively delicate and never approaches Ventolin level irritating. And even in spite of that, he could still get some particularly engaging listening experiences out of some extremely minimalistic and stripped back approaches. My least favorite stuff of his I can still respect for its sonic artistry, but there is some material that could connect a bit deeper than that. I am genuinely glad I sat with his stuff beyond just being educated on his work, and if I'm in the right mood for it, some of his stuff could find a place in my life. Even if I'm probably not going to keep around most of those. Though, if his ultra-minimalist style isn't your cup of tea, this latest album, Ultratronics, might actually be worth giving a shot because it's surprisingly way more accessible than the usual from him. It's the single most normal-sounding IDM album to date by a huge margin. And sure, you still have some of the usual abstract experimental pieces you'd expect from him here and there, and every track is just as packed to the brim full of crazy glitch effects as always. See the IDM beats materializing out of a sea of glitches in tracks 1 through 3. But a lot of these tracks also have regular old electro industrial grooves and melodies and stuff, and it's mostly approached in a very straightforward and traditionally musical way. Track 5 has lots of electronic percussion going over it that almost starts to resemble a hip-hop beat, alongside lots of very pleasant ambient pads. Similar melodic paths show up on track 10 and even start to envelop more of the mix throughout tracks 11 through 14. Starts to remind me a bit of 90s Cabaret Voltaire or even Ski Mask. Tracks 7 through 9 have full-on banging 80s industrial and EBM beats with deep bass lines, and track 7 has all these garbled voices listing out the NATO alphabet, which is thematically appropriate given how some of his older music sounds like it's being generated out of Morse code. And one of the best moments is track 4, which takes a standard skittering IDM beat with some glassy chords and all these speak and spell type electronic voices start trying to count all the numbers from 1 to 30 in a sequence, and occasionally get the placements of two numbers mixed up and get called out for being incorrect. It nails a very specific kind of, later period Kraftwerk-y charm. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if the far more conventional approach of this album actually ends up being a disappointment to some of Ikeda's core fan base. It's not even close to as unique or out of the box as a lot of the material that he's best known for, and isn't nearly as much of a demonstration of what sets him apart from the crowd. I don't even know if I'd say it's one of his better paced albums. But even removed from the context of his previous catalog, this stuff is very well made for what it is. The industrial grooves do hit hard and the glitch work, while maybe feeling a bit more randomly generated and less intentionally structured than some of his other albums, still does well to give all of this material a sense of sonic density. It's not at all an indicative starting point to let you know what he's all about. I think Dataplex would still probably serve you better in that department. And it's not exactly the most mind-blowing collection of electro and IDM ever made, but it is a lot of easily likable fun in a way that doesn't require much mental effort, which isn't something you'd expect to say about a new project from this guy, so I'll definitely take it. I'm feeling a strong 7.7 out of 10 on this one. Next up from Give Me Monaco, Luminance EP. Man, you know, I already really liked Give Me Monaco's Inferno EP that he dropped back in October and I covered in the last roundup. Thought he really showcased his melodic strengths and created a quick 4-track experience that I kept wanting to come back to, but I feel like he's even further leveled up with this latest offering. Just as solid melodically, but a noticeable step up in terms of the sound design and textures, which feel a fair bit more striking than they already did before. It's as much of an improvement on Inferno that EP was to his debut album before that. All 4 tracks here are great. Basalt absolutely slaps, hits you with some fast-paced sandy acoustic percussion that borders on drum and bass and features all these sick acid breakdowns and breathy background vocals. Lahar takes a bit to get going as a bit of an alright off-kilter intro, but then the mix is joined by all these really deep and grooving electric bass lines and more breathy vocal chops and translees that are both really full-sounding, but also feel like they convey this sense of open space. Magma features a bit of an offbeat percussion mix, underscoring its much sharper chords, but slowly introduces more and more brighter melodic progressions that really feel like they hit a more joyful emotional note. But to me, the biggest winner is Caldera, which evolves from a really refreshing mix of kalimbas and house vocal chops and pays into these epic glittering trance leads near the end. Seems Give Me Monaco is starting to gain a little more traction, what with his also getting highlighted in a Bandcamp Daily feature and a collab with another artist which I'll be getting to later in this video. And those boosts he's been seeing are wholly deserved, so definitely make sure to give this a shot. I'm overall feeling an 8.3 out of 10 on this. Next up from Son Zept, New Ireland Chrome EP. You know, when I automatically followed the Analogical Force label on Bandcamp after buying Music's Skrulage album in 2021, I wasn't expecting to eventually run into an artist I'd already heard of thanks to their having sent me projects in for $10 Patreon requests. Yes, Liam McCartan, aka Son Zept, is an artist who I've covered before, both in what I think was my first ever public Patreon text post review, as well as a proper video and a slightly longer album he did, since I was feeling particularly nice that day. I may not have exactly felt the urge to keep around his music longer term, but he was easily among the most professional sounding artists who's ever sent something into me on that tier, even to this day. And while his IDM sound could maybe be a bit on the derivative side, he always produced it very well and was quite versatile with it. So when I got the notification for this New Ireland Chrome EP, I was like, oh hey, I remember that guy, and I threw it into this roundup out of curiosity. And yeah, it turns out this EP was pretty nice. It's not exactly delivering the most distinct IDM blend I've ever heard, but it is quite solidly visceral and banging, with lots of skittering fast-paced beats that have a lot of punch and weight behind them. I'd say the tracks that work the best for me are Slime and Salament Clock. Their mix of heavier IDM breaks and twinkling melodies give me the same vibes as some of the heaviest moments on Ski Mask's Pool, and I do quite like the latter cut's more epic drum and bass approach. And the other 3 cuts are very nice too. 10 Ton adds a bit of a grimy hip-hop and mild G-funk flavor to the same kinds of mixes. Moon Tape provides a brief ambient breather, and 7X Rain makes for a satisfying finish to the EP, maybe not going as hard as other tracks here, but still nailing down a solid skittering groove with some fairly refreshing melodic washes. I doubt this EP is going to be like changing anyone's life, and I'm probably not going to be hanging on to it longer term either, but it was definitely a fun listen, and if you find the sound intriguing, it'll be worth giving a shot. I'm overall feeling a 7.3 out of 10 on it. Next up from Kelly Lee Owens, LP8-2.
We are feeling.
Yes, and Kelly Lee Owens also recently came out with a companion EP to add on to her LP8 album from last year. Given I like the main album enough to mark it as my number 8 favorite album of 2022, I figured this out to be worth hearing as well. And yeah, it definitely was nice in all the same ways as the album was, delivering a lot of pristinely produced mixes of industrial percussion going over super tranquil and meditative open ambient spaces, creating a really solid progressive buildup of ambient and IDM approaches on opener rituals, introducing some timpanis in the mix in a cool way on the first song, which for whatever reason is the 3rd song here. Also, the 2 other cuts, Mobius and Find Our Way, have more defined and coherent lyrics than I think anything that made it onto the main album. Of the 2, Mobius was definitely the more striking and satisfying in spite of its melody sounding pulled from the same tune she broke into at the end of her track Sonic 8. All this stuff was predictably really nice and refreshing and sounded absolutely gorgeous, just as well polished and finished sounding as the album tracks. However, I will also have to admit that it is very unlikely I'm going to come back to anything from this EP or keep it around longer term, if only because, for me, the greatest asset of the album it adds on to was its pitch-perfect pacing. The fact that every track on LP8 felt like it served a very specific device in the greater context of the whole album with no redundancy. Adding on a couple of leftovers, while nice to hear, doesn't feel entirely necessary to me. But still, if you liked LP8 as much as I did and are game for a little more of the same, it's probably worth at least one listen, so I think I can still give this a 7.3 out of 10. Next up from Break Science, Mecha Flora EP. And for the last of these EPs to go through in this roundup, we got a new one from Break Science, the electro-hip-hop and EDM duo of Adam Deitch and Borum Lee. These guys' 2 proper albums out so far are both absolutely fantastic in my opinion. 7 Bridges from 2013 was number 100 when I made my top 100 favorite albums of all time list in 2016. And Grid of Souls from 2018 was my number 5 favorite album from that year as well. They also once did a really solid EP with Michael Menner called Twilight Frequency, which is absolutely worth hearing. Their production is always so lush and incredibly well balanced and hard-hitting and totally knocked out of the park. If you have any passing interest in this kind of EDM hip-hop hybrid, they absolutely need to be on your radar. They are criminally underrated, and at this point any new release from these guys is gonna get me excited to hear it. And while this EP didn't sweep me off my feet as much as I was hoping, it is still very solid and nice if you wanted a more dedicated look on the more chill side of their sound. The opening moments with cuts like the almost synth-wavy title track and the pleasant deep-voiced rap verses from Nico Is going over some mildly flashy, lone-esque beat work on Live Twice, while nice, did at first have me a tiny bit worried. Cuts like these are quite good, but felt a little underwhelming when I went in half expecting some like heavier melodic bangers, kind of like what they did on Grid of Souls. And I also thought the EP had a bit of a forgettable closer in Crystal Lake, despite some neat acid breakdowns in a few parts. Though the other 3 tracks on this thing are excellent. The Call-In combines its lush and atmospheric synth soundscapes with these dramatic piano samples that totally get the deeper emotional rushes, as do the warm mixes of guitars and keyboards and synths on Share the Stealth, which feel like I'm being sunk into a warm bath and happen to have some really nice bubbly dubstep wubbing going on around me. But the best cut has to be the even more dramatic and emotional Steady Within, featuring all the subtle and organic Asian instrumentation and some really solid rap verses and sung choruses from Lily Fangs. This track was starting to hit back on a little some of that psychedelic transcendence I experienced on an old track of theirs like Breath of Space. I do kind of wish all 6 tracks on this EP were able to deliver on a quality of a track like this, but I suppose 3 of them hitting on that level, and the other 3 at least being pretty good, is still more than satisfactory for me. It's not the best work they've ever done, but its biggest standouts are so good that they absolutely still make it worth hearing, so yeah, I'll definitely give it my recommendation. 7.5 out of 10 on this. Next up from iCube, iCube. And here's another artist I was not at all expecting to get the chance to go back and check out. iCube is the alias for French producer Nikolai Chai. Sorry for butchered pronunciations as per usual. Decently well known for his work in the worlds of French downtempo and deep house. He was once remixed by Daft Punk before they blew up. And he's also decently well known for his work with Gilbert Cohen, aka DJ Gilbert, in the downtempo duo Chateau Flight, who I'd actually first heard of when I was a kid thanks to their having remixed Air once, and also hearing their track Camping Jazz through an iTunes Essentials playlist. I randomly saw a new album from this guy show up in the Bandcamp Daily feed one day. I was like, hang on, iCube, that name sounds familiar. I feel like I've gotten a random request or two to check that guy out a while back. So I looked him up and decided to throw him in here, and for the sake of my own education, to go back and listen to his other albums, of which he apparently only has 5, and his last one was all the way back in 2012. So I also decided on him to also check out the 2 Chateau Flight albums as a bonus, because I doubt I'm going to get a better opportunity for that, and there's only 2. So here's my quick thoughts on those. Oh wow, this is lovely. A very refreshing mix of jazzy downtempo and deep house that both keeps the tighter grooves and more emotional textures of both genres. Such a smooth and laid back but still danceable listen that sunk me in super quickly, not even to get into the banging French disco cuts like the title track later on. Album's a bit on the overlong side and could stand to get edited down a bit, but great stuff regardless. Pretty much just a slightly better polished repeat of the first album, no major complaints here. The first Chateau Flight album works in all the same ways that the first 2 iCube albums do, groovy and occasionally jazzy downtempo mixes that are real easy to sink yourself into, maybe with a slight bit more of an organic touch and less deep housey, but still pretty much the same kind of stuff. And I think I might have enjoyed it even more, although the track with all those voices of some guy blowing bubbles in a bath very much lived up to its title. That was kinda weird. Pretty much the same blend of styles as usual, though going out of its way to feel more varied and eclectic and more overtly quirky, I suppose. Got everything from the usual lovely downtempo to mildly dubby disco to super straightforward house to minimal IDM to even hip-hop and breakbeat. One track features RZA of all people. The second Chateau Flight album is somehow markedly quirkier than the first, got a lot more rubbery electro influence here too and a lot more vocal guests. Not sure if it's quite as strong or consistent, but it's got its moments for sure. It's worth hearing for Super Flight alone. I've often seen this live album listed as one of his main albums, and it does appear to be all original material, so I checked it out. If you wanted him to approach his usual blend of sounds from an even spacier and more atmospheric angle and present it over the course of a single 55-minute open-ended evolving electronic jam session, this one will be for you. And speaking of single 55-minute mega mixes, this is an album that shows him interlocking 24 much smaller cuts of varying banging house and techno arrangements, way more about the thick dance grooves this time around. Not the most seamless mix I've ever heard, but certainly flows very well regardless and has more than enough bops to go around for me to call it one of his better projects. So yeah, I think iCube has my respect, definitely has his share of quality releases. I might end up hanging on to stuff like Picnic Attack or Puzzle or Megamix. Those were probably my favorites in this mini-marathon. But he is very consistent and all of these releases are pretty close to each other quality-wise. Well, that brings us to here, the actual new iCube album that serves as his comeback and first new full-length release in over a decade. Though, while I say full-length, it is worth noting that this album is also way shorter than any of the other projects I just got done going through. While pretty much all of those albums were somewhere around an hour long, this one's a much briefer 37 minutes with only 8 tracks. Not to mention he went about making it very differently from the norm for him, opting to instead go for a much more improvisational method, pulling out his synths and just kind of seeing where things might end up. Letting his emotions in the moment guide him and putting the material together fairly quickly without belaboring over it much. And the result is not just the smallest scale main album of his, but also the lowest stakes main album of his, and the least polished. Not that his music has ever exactly been the highest stakes stuff to begin with, but this is easily his scantest offering yet that still counts as an album. And the shorter length didn't actually result in a tighter or more consistent listen than what he usually delivers. But it's not a way less consistent listen either. It's still an all-around nice time, and the tracks here are still more distinct and defined and easier to recall than, say, his material on something like Live at the Planetarium, even if not as well textured. You do occasionally get a couple of tracks that can feel like they don't have much to them, see the more enveloping soundtracky synth ambient material explored in cuts like Gypsotech or Montesaurus, or the slightly repetitive and minimal synth riffs adding up to a still generally pleasant closer in Infinite Melodies. But there are also cuts that might make better use of their simpler approach, like how the ambience of the intro cut Prismatic conveys a pretty impressive sense of space that consistently pulled me in, or how Casio Plus One throws this very playful little synth tune with a particularly French jazzy overtone. You could call it a bit cheesy, but I find it quite charming. And a number of cuts try to add more meat on their bones and go for something comparatively more epic, especially the 8-minute Vanta Blue, which really takes you on a journey through lots of buzzing textures and sweeping beatwork. Also the much darker and more unnerving experimentations of a cut like La Grotte au Faith, or the triumphantly driving ambient synth washes going up next to all these thunderous analog drum machines on 000148 to particularly engaging effect. Do I think anything on this album is gonna change your life? Probably not. If this hadn't come from a well-established artist I wanted to check out the greater back catalog of, depending on how busy the year was and how much I wanted to edit this roundup down, I could have just skipped over covering it out of lack of things to say, but as far as super simple and stripped-back synth improvisations go, I still enjoyed myself the whole way through. There were definitely some standout moments that really pulled me in and had me like, oh, I like that. And there was nothing that outright pushed me away from it either. The worst moments are still nice, and it's definitely not like a half-baked effort or anything. I mean, if you like stripped-back analog synths, this will serve you quite well, and I think it achieved all it set out to do, unambitious as its goals may have been, so I think that all adds up to this album getting away with a solid 7 out of 10. Next up from Charaxes, Colors Tease. Alright, let's finally get into some of the random Bandcamp diving I've done, and we're starting with one of the most unique sounding experimental ambient projects I've heard in some time. This no-name artist from St. Louis has provided us with this very strange electroacoustic conceptual project heavily inspired by nature and being out in the forest, maybe even with a bit of a fantasy sci-fi bend in there as well. And that naturalistic atmosphere is captured extremely vividly through some particularly out-there blends of instrumentation from all over the world. Various bongos and tribal percussion, kalimbas and bowls, gamelan influences, detuned woodwinds, flutes, panpipes, and even horns. Light synth excursions that also have a bit of an organic flavor to them, and of course, plenty of field recordings. The sound design is always fairly sparse and compositionally can occasionally be rather abstract and disorienting, but always aims to directly transport you into its magical forest setting and does so extremely effectively, coming together like the musical equivalent of like an arts and crafts project made entirely out of leaves and sticks and mushrooms and the like. Whether it be on these much sparser experimental pieces like the prepared pianos of Scare Deer that give things a slight modern classical bend, the eastern flutes and bird recordings on Birds 1 eventually paying off into this off-kilter horn solo at the end, the mystical warped woodwinds creating the ambience of luminary clearing that allow that track to live up to its title, or the especially dramatic and unnerving tones of Overlight, which almost seem to act as this album's big climax. But there's also plenty of tracks that have a bit more of an accessible approach to them, with some more pleasant regular rhythms on a track like Grasshopper and all its mixes of kalimbas and mildly foot-tapping percussion, or the more thunderous buildups of the percussion and occasional trumpets on Birds 2, which add up to particularly psychedelic and hypnotic effect. And of course there's also Petrichor, which after an intro of melodic bowl tapping, features this subtle thumping techno beat underneath everything to add in these more melodic textures that even start to feel like it's evoking more of like a more understated John Hopkins-y type track. There are a couple of tracks here which may not stick with me as much as others, namely the alien ambience of Nocturne, which I didn't find quite as satisfying as other moments here, or the closer Contact, which had a cool melodic intro but ended up ditching that idea and meandering through a few others that didn't really have anything to do with where it started. Not the strongest of finishes there. And the mastering on the whole project isn't always the most consistent, and not every sound is as well blended as it could be, the kind of thing that sounds like it could be made out of like external sample diving excursions, not unlike the way I assemble my own music. Though even if that is the case, it's well blended enough that it's hard to tell, and in either case that's impressive enough as is. You could maybe call its mishmash of cultural signifiers from all over the world a bit cliché occasionally, but I'm a bit of a sucker for any projects which utilize instrumentation this lush and well varied, and it's really damn impressive work coming from an artist who has basically no audience outside of presumably the very minor push they got from the Bandcamp Daily feature, so please make sure to give them some attention yourself. I thought this was really cool. I'm overall feeling an 8.3 out of 10 on it. Next up from Yarni and Give Me Monaco, Parenthesis. Yeah, we're not done with Give Me Monaco. In addition to the Luminance EP I was praising earlier in this roundup, he also did this whole collaboration album with Yarni, which dropped only 2 weeks after the EP. The two artists have already been collaborating for a minute now. At the beginning of last year, they dropped a single together called Orgon, featuring Emily Marks, that appears to have silently blown up on Spotify, or at least blown up relative to Give Me Monaco's other work. Yarni apparently has a significantly bigger core audience. I hadn't heard of him before this. But the two hit it off and kept wanting to make collabs, which eventually resulted in this entire full-length album. And while I'm less hot on this than I was on the Luminance EP and don't think it's as tightly consistent, it's still comparable in quality with individual moments that hit just as big heights. A couple of tracks here and there strike me as comparatively not as interesting. For instance, 6-4, which is a solid enough minimal house cut that takes a bit too long to reveal where its title comes from. Or Chaos, which has some nice kalimbas in the beginning, but I can't remember much of the rest of it aside from not actually being all that chaotic. Or Hold with Emily Marks. While it's nice to hear this kind of instrumental with a regular vocalist instead of a vocal chop, the tune itself was disappointingly on the forgettable side. But there's also better cuts like OSD with its deeper and marginally more soulful vocal chops going over some much more clattering breaks, or Shroud with its much more uplifting and triumphant major key tones. And the best moments on this project are legit excellent. Opener Speak No. 2 takes a moody piano performance and evolves it into a pretty epic breakbeat banger. Plucked and Struck features some of the most organic, well-textured percussion blends on the album, and combines it with some especially funky guitar and bass work. Tate goes for one of the darker and more menacing tunes here and gets its blends of kalimbas and vocal chops to blend really effectively next to its John Hopkins-esque bass rumbling. Weavers is a very pretty little acoustic guitar number to close the whole experience out. And of course, the best moment for me, unquestionably, has to be Reich, the brightest and most up-tempo cut of all of them, featuring some especially fast-paced percussion patterns, still going up next to some fairly melancholy chord progressions and very pretty bell melodies that end up adding up to this album's single biggest emotional height. I'm not sure if I think this album is properly great as a complete whole, but it is very close to that level, if that. The worst moments here are still plenty enjoyable on their own, and the best moments here are, again, legit excellent and easily make it worth the price of admission. The whole thing is definitely worth hearing if you've missed it. If you're looking to get your organic and uplifting minimal house fix, these two deliver plenty of gems, and I'm overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10 on it. Next up from Phaeleh, A New Day. Gotta give a shout to this new album from Phaeleh. He really caught my interest in late 2021 when he put out his last album, Soma, which ended up as my number 8 favorite album of that entire year. And when I went through his back catalog for my Some Stuff I Miss segment on that album, I also particularly latched onto his 2010 album, Fallen Light, which I now own a CD of. He mostly adheres to this one particular signature style of chilled out, refreshing, and super well-textured down-tempo combined with old-school dubstep arrangements. And some of his albums can occasionally run together and didn't leave as strong an impression as the next. A lot of his albums are pretty much the same. But the core style he always sticks to does fairly invariably lead to some extraordinarily pretty material that can fulfill a similar niche for me as artists like Sounds from the Ground, albeit approached from a very different angle with different influences. And with this latest project, A New Day, not much has changed. He's predictably delivering all the same blends of sounds you'd already expect from him, with nothing really in the way of surprises. But that core sound is also just as well executed as it always is. On average, I do think this album's first half is significantly stronger than its second half. At first, you're given all these fantastic evocative cuts that follow his trademark textured atmospheric sound to gorgeous effect, whether that be with cuts that feature some really nice soothing vocal guests like Devin Renee's performance on Burning Light, or Shauna Heckman's performance on Outside the Lines, both featuring especially strong tunes. There are tracks that focus on his standard chill dubstep garage sound and do it super well, like Walk Away. The pitched up sample on that one is especially strong and catchy. Need to Feel goes for a more stripped back and intimate approach with more guitars but still delivers a particularly strong tune, and No More feels especially dramatic and cinematic with its synth string pads and pitch down hook. Lots of quality to be found here. I do feel like the album does start to slide off for me for a while though, starting with the track One Chance. Devin Renee's vocals and the core tune on that one is still serviceable for what it is, but not quite as good as what came before. And then there's a bunch of instrumentals in a row that didn't leave quite as strong an impression on me. I guess I kinda like the moody guitar excursions on Cascades, but they're rather muted, and they're sort of repeated to less interesting effect on the title track. And then there's some sparse beats and pads on Resolve that, while very soothing again, wasn't nearly as striking to me as the stuff that showed up in the first half. But any misgivings I may have with the second half of this album are all made up for by the final track, Breakout, which is almost certainly the biggest highlight out of anything on the whole album. A massive 10-minute breakbeat epic with tons of crashing amen breaks and soaring melodies that are absolutely nothing short of stunning. So yeah, this album was all around just as enjoyable as I went in expecting it to be. It can be a bit uneven and isn't as big a winner as Fallen Light or Soma. I haven't heard albums of his like Clarity or Lost Time in a long time, but this feels closer to the level of quality of projects like those. Kinda more middle tier by his standards, but still, he always does this sound particularly well, and there's still more than enough stellar standouts on display here for the whole thing to get my recommendation anyway, so yeah, I'm overall feeling a 7.5 out of 10 on this one. Next up from Luke Vibert, Machine Funk. Well, Luke Vibert is back once again to deliver his annual contribution to the world of old-school acid techno. Last year he delivered one of the simplest and most straightforward acid projects yet, with Grit, that I covered in a full video, mainly so that I could go through his greater back catalog. And now he's got another album that's pretty much the exact same deal as that one. All the same thick old-school drum machines and acid synths you've come to expect, with a bit more of a lighthearted and pleasant edge to the melodies on display. This one thankfully isn't quite as much of a one-note monolithic experience as Grit was, though this also strikes me as more of a mixed bag with higher high points and lower low points. On one hand, there are some really weak cuts on here that I was not feeling. Most notably, I thought the melodies on Major Minor, while decently likable if isolated, did not gel well together when layered over each other, and add up to an unpleasantly awkward effect. And the near 8-minute Hitler Skelter, ignoring its typically eye-roll-inducing edgelordy title, was a particularly dull drag for me that just never seemed to go anywhere. In general, I think most of the opening stretch of the album was pretty middling, outside of maybe the generally likable ascending arpeggios of Stairs Wine. Though ironically, the album does markedly pick up when we get to the track Non-Starter. That one has a much brighter and more accessible melodic approach that's actually quite catchy. Similar deal with the following track, Justification. Really like the melodies on both of these tracks. Also really like how hard the acid grooves of Juxtaposition goes, and how intense the bass and beats get on Taming of the View. Flipping the old school drum machines into some dubstep patterns on Bloodstep was a pretty fun idea. And Luke on Acid makes for a strong closer too that has a bit more of an atmospheric bend. Swear I can hear a very light orchestral sample in the background of that one. So this album is definitely more lopsided and inconsistent than Grit and not as well sequenced, but it is much better varied, with more moments that stick out to me as memorable, so I guess that cancels out to me enjoying the two projects the exact same amount. It's not going to be a keeper, and it's not among Vibert's best work, and probably it's not even the best retro acid project I'll be highlighting in this roundup. Stay tuned. But it was a fun listen as always, so just as I did with Grit, I will score this a very light, solid 7 out of 10. Next up from Optometry, After Image. Okay, Optometry is a new side venture of the long-running techno mainstay John Tejada, working in collaboration with singer and guitarist Mark Adstrom. And it's a pretty interesting mix of synth-pop, trip-hop, electro, and even mild rock and electroacoustic elements. Tejada providing a lot of buzzing bassy synths with thicker synthetic percussion to underscore Adstrom's mildly sultry trip-hoppy vocals, occasional guitar work, and even some extra instrumentation like woodwinds and violins and stuff, provided by frequent Plaid collaborator Mason B, aka Bennett Walsh. And this group already seems to have an identity decently well nailed down. Tracks range from some raw electro grooves with a slight 80s tinge as seen on Chameleon or Faces Without Names, some cuts with more of an alternative pop edge like Permanent Shadow and Whatever You Need. Those two probably have the catchiest tunes behind them out of these cuts. Occasionally you get a more atmospheric blend like Not What You Expected or the entirely ambient closer Cathedral, which makes for an especially striking finish. And most of the cuts with Mason B end up being major emotional highlights, especially the various strings and warm synths on Falling, or the mix of clarinets that back up Larger Than Me. There are some cuts that don't really stick out, like Technicolor and Safe. Those kind of just end up serving more to establish the formula that Optometry aims to make its overarching identity and didn't have the strongest of tunes to back themselves up. And on the whole, I'm not going to say this album totally swept me off my feet or anything. Occasionally the album could fall in the background a bit or run together for me. I don't know if it'll be a long-term keeper, but it might be, actually. I mean, it is a really nice and pleasant listen with, again, a fairly unique sound that did catch my ear and make me want to put it in this roundup. And I didn't come out feeling negative about anything. The worst cuts here are still nice, and the best cuts were starting to border on resonating a bit on that deeper level. Maybe the Mason B features put this comparison in my mind, but it sometimes feels like I'm listening to a collection of Plaid's electroacoustic tracks, which are often my favorites of theirs. Though it also kind of does its own thing separate from them, too. It's hard to explain. In any case, I definitely like this more than some of the more recent solo albums Tejada's put out lately, and those were already pretty good in their own right, so yeah, I would say this is worth hearing. I'm overall feeling a 7.5 out of 10 on it. Next up from Apostrophe, Distance Between Light and Dark. Oh yeah, you remember that ambient jazz composer I was talking about at the beginning of this roundup who released an album I really liked right at the end of last year? He's already followed up his December album with this project, which dropped at the beginning of March, and that actually resonated with me almost just as much as a Hypothesis did for a lot of the same reasons while getting markedly less attention, so I decided to cover it too. This album does feel a fair bit more classical oriented than the other one, a little sparser in its arrangements as well, with more tracks that get darker and more experimental, but the compositions are just as sophisticated and emotionally deep. Right from the very start, this album starts out in the most dramatic way with Epitaph, which just hits you with a swirling mix of strings, woodwinds, pianos that add up to a deeply brooding experimental drone that perfectly sets the tone for the album you're about to get. And the rest of the album delivers similar well-textured ambient drones that fittingly seem to go back and forth between light and dark, although always conveying a deep sense of sadness, whether that be through intimate piano and string performances like Call Me When You Get There, more open-sounding orchestral arrangements like Tokyo 4 AM and Quiet Storm that do convey some of the deepest emotional arrangements, or perhaps some slightly twinklier arrangements like the bells and keyboards that go through the likes of Nausea Numbered 1 or the title track. The former of those might be my favorite cut here. And as the album nears closer to the end, the tracks seem to get even darker, like the slow-paced organic rhythms of Solstice Blues or the Blade Runner-esque synth blips going over cellos on Theorem. Perhaps there are some tracks which had me wishing they were a bit better textured. Adagio has lots of really nice string pads and a few different interlocking sections, but a few parts in the middle that dragged a tiny bit. And the closer Lost Childhood felt like a bit of an anticlimax way to finish the project off. A bit more of a plain-sounding drone piece that didn't really go anywhere that interesting. In general, I think this album's second half was less impressive to me than its first half, but still, plenty of really nice work here once again. Also, after I wrote the segment, he also put out a third project which might also be worth hearing called 2068, The Year I Die Old, which features a lot more synth-heavy dark ambient arrangements. That one seemed pretty nice too in its own separate way as well, despite one track with a slightly questionable title that made me roll my eyes. But yeah, this guy's been doing a lot of good work, that much I think is abundantly clear. On this particular project, I'm feeling a 7.5 out of 10. Next up from Jerome Hill, Flow Mechanics. So, you know how I said at the end of the Luke Vibert segment that he didn't have the best retro acid project of this roundup? This is the one who did. Released by someone who's actually been DJing in the scene since the early 90s and releasing tracks since the late 90s, both on his own and in the group Groove Asylum, among others. Also managing several different labels such as Don't Recordings and Super Rhythm Tracks. But this is technically his debut album as far as I can tell, and it released on the label that Vibert had been releasing a lot of his acid banger material in more recent years, Hypercolor. I had no idea who Jerome Hill was when I came across this album, though. I just thought the album cover looked cool and threw it in here for the heck of it, and turned out to get a whole bunch of really fun acid bangers. Much more of a heavier and dance-centric listen than the one Vibert just put out, but about equally as serious. Which is to say, very much not serious at all. The album is peppered with various interludes that I guess are trying to be comedic, including 2 about chickens and 1 about toast, which I think kind of ended up more distracting than anything. But in terms of the bulk of the main tracks, it's pretty much all hits and no misses. Be it straightforward acid techno, like Walk the Plank and The Doctor Will See You Now, old school electro like Deafening Lull and Don't Be Afraid, Those two are easily the heaviest and most visceral out of all the cuts here. Frantic breakbeat workouts like Knob Jitter, Acid Tinged House, and Stax Head the Funk, with lots of growling samples about the difference between Stax records and Motown records back in the old days, which I find quite charming. Maybe you'll get a bit more ravey house in the closer I Don't. All of it goes super hard, and it's great. And the only miss I'd say is Brought Up Badly, which has all these chopped up samples going, oh my, oh my, oh my, that got pretty dang annoying. They're like this album's equivalent to the push it samples on 808 State's new build. But still, I can't really complain about the rest of this album. It's very simple, but very effective at what it's trying to do, and even if it's not as stacked with bangers as that last Carl Cox album in terms of quantity, the appeal isn't too far away from that, albeit without any of the more modernized touches. It's all retro drum machines, but bangs comparably hard anyway. If you want your old school acid fix for this early part of the year, I think Jerome Hill has you covered. And if you already have your old school acid fix, might be still worth hearing anyway. I'll give it a 7.7 out of 10. Next up from The Humble Bee, Lichen Cloak on a White Stone. Going back to the ambient music world, The Humble Bee is the alias for producer Craig Tattersall, who's been regularly putting out projects under the name since the end of the 2000s, though I haven't heard anything else he's released. Let me know if you've heard any of his other stuff and know about some projects that you think I ought to be checking out as well. But I only just found out he existed through this project being highlighted in a Bandcamp Daily, obviously. The release for a label called Quiet Details, which has been seeing quite a bit of success for how little is released on it so far and how niche the artists releasing on it appear to be. I figured another little nature-themed ambient project out to be up my alley, and the geological theming of this one seemed like a somewhat unique idea. And it is in fact a pretty cool listen, combining lots of suitably high-detailed field recordings with very low-key recordings of pianos and synth pads is something to emotionally connect with. A lot of the times the field recordings end up becoming more the attention-grabbing element with their particular ASMR-like quality that, true to the label name, has lots of quiet details. Especially the case for the first two-thirds of the album, with moments like the ocean-like sea of light noise in Petrified Wood, or the punctuated pianos on Ancient Fissures Fused with Time, or Opener A Spearhead in My Pocket. I think said Opener was my favorite cut. Oh, in the last third, the music itself starts to come into much greater focus, as seen on the reverb-soaked guitars on Flakes of Rust Fill My Hand, or the wailing pads that slowly envelop the entirety of the closer, Concealed by Yellow. This is not an album that really gives me a lot to specifically say about it, and I'm almost certainly not going to be hanging on to it longer term, but it did have me pretty well captivated in spite of its simplicity. I've seen the album compared to an even lower key take on a Tim Hecker kind of sound, and that seems like a fitting way to describe it as well. So, yeah, I mean, if you're curious, give it a shot. I'm overall feeling a solid 7 out of 10 on this one. Next up from India Sky, Somewhere Over the Mystic Moon.
Hillside as I break down and cry.
Okay, next on the list is something a little different. This is a pretty interesting mix of stripped-back 80s synth pop coming from a bit of an industrial and ambient angle, but also combined with a lot of the artist's own neo-soul vocals. As you guess, I found it through a Bandcamp Daily feature. And while at first I was drawn to the project through the particular unique mix of influences it was purported to have, I was initially prepared for a bit of a weirder listen than I actually got. And it's not really as out of the box as I thought it was going to be. It's very straightforward and accessible, but that turned out to not matter much either, because in spite of its simplicity, this was an interestingly really replayable project that kept me wanting to come back to it. First and foremost, India Sky is an excellent singer. Her voice sounds fantastic all over these fairly stripped-back synth instrumentals. She's absolutely got an ear for hooks and melodies as well. All these tracks are particularly catchy and easy to get into. This mix of talents is pretty easily visible on the opening and closing tracks, Dark Symphony and I Pray, which mix some mostly percussionless synth backings with her own vocal performances, and her voice and the subtle catchiness of the melodies make the tracks attention-grabbing all on their own. She does occasionally allow some weirder and more experimental flares to show through, for instance on the off-kilter harmonies on Like a Wave, or the pair of ambient interludes in The Moon and Mirrors. The latter sounds especially cool with its various cascades of synth progressions. Though easily the best two tracks here were the two tracks she released as pre-album singles in Breakdown and Bottom of the Sea. as they're the most energetic and striking in the bunch. The former has these really well-layered, occasionally processed vocal harmonies and breezy, slightly 90s flavored beats, with almost certainly the best tune on display here. And the latter goes for a slightly more surreal-sounding techno flavor, but creating a lot of really nice atmosphere out of its mixes of synths and lots of vocal effects going over its snapping percussion. Again, really solid tune behind this one as well. There are a few cuts that I suppose don't stand out as much as the others, like Begin Again and Palace of Pleasure, which could lean a tiny bit more towards 80s cliches that I didn't find as striking, but still, this is a really tight and breezy listen at only a half hour, and these cuts don't weigh down the experience much. Only time will tell how much longer-term staying power this ends up having. It's possible this ends up shrinking on me later, but right now, it's the kind of listen that I've kept wanting to come back to and revisit more. It reminds me of what I like in my favorite mildly experimental 80s synth-pop records, with, again, a particularly impressive singer. And even if its appeals are more on the subtle side than I thought they would be when I first came across it, those appeals are definitely starting to resonate on a deeper level. I will get it if this didn't stick out to others as much as it did to me, but I can see myself keeping it around in the coming months, and I got enough out of it to let it get away with a solid 8 out of 10. Next up from Jade Cicada, Pressure Gamut. Jade Cicada is a neurohop artist from Massachusetts who I'd never heard of before, but apparently started out as one half of the short-lived duo Wonky Llama in 2014 before switching to putting out solo releases since 2016-ish. They already have a pretty sizable and dedicated fan base, and I think this is their second album. I haven't heard any other Jade Cicada material outside of this project, but it was the first album of 2023 that I saw people buzzing about and requesting after it came out on January 1st. So I threw it in here, and okay, you know how last year an album by Tipper called Marble Hunting made my year-end list? You remember that project? Imagine that album with less variety and more designed to be a continuous mix, and that's Jade Cicada's Pressure Gamut. Pretty much immediately I was struck by the similarity between this project and that last Tipper album, especially noticeable on drops of tracks like Loom and Schlemiel, which have all that wobbling bass going over the hip-hop breakbeats, which were almost a dead ringer for Tipper tracks like Guilty Feet, and I won't lie, that sense of direct deja vu, even if probably coincidental, might have been a mark against the album for me. But at the same time, I suppose there's only so much I can complain about an album that sounds like one of my favorite projects of last year, especially when it works in a lot of the same ways and has equally top-notch production values. I do like the banger tracks like Loom and Bamboozled with their intense bass wobbles, or the more skittering drum and bass approach to a track like Chonkra. Also, the other half of Wonky Llama, Shmoop, shows up to help out on 2 tracks, which are quite solid as well, and the blockier, noisier breakbeat work out of Morsels, and the bouncier and squelchier bass of Pigeon Toad. But the tracks that more commonly turned out to be my favorites were the more chill moments that allowed a bit more melody to come in. See all the layers of squelchy synth blips throughout the intro track Acid Trip Advisor, the skittering beats and trancier arpeggios and wrapped in echoes, or the wiry and comparatively more emotional leads on the closer So Long. Not that this is an album trying to hit on an emotional level at any point, it's way more about sounding cool above all else, but it does have one attempt at having more of a heart. All 10 tracks here are quite good, and the fact that they segue together as effectively as they do is at least a point the album has over Marble Hunting, which felt more like a scattered selection of tracks, although I still feel like that album had more ideas and textures to explore. Not to belabor the point of their similarity too hard, the fact that there exists an album that I really got into last year that serves pretty much the exact same purpose does mean I'm less likely to return to this one, but I also feel like if you liked one, you'll like the other as well, and I can still give my recommendation to it. I'm overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10 on it. Next up from Costa, Twilight Transmission. Next up on the list of random Bandcamp Daily Recs, we got this project from an Irish downtempo artist. A bit of an interesting concept album centered around radio and how once upon a time it used to serve to help expand people's tastes instead of just playing the same top 40 stuff over and over, as explored through a bit of a low-key mix of minimal house beats and lo-fi hip-hop. It's a very simple-sounding project, but it's quite effective at the sound it's going for, whether that be airy and open mixes of piano samples and minimal percussion on As the Rain Fell, pained and desperate-sounding jazz loops going over breezier beats on Vox, standard lo-fi hip-hop synths with trumpet flourishes on Sensitive Station, a moody trudge through sluggish beats and deep and dark piano chords on closer Sin E, or the 7-minute Minimal House mini-epic of late-night jazz radio, which features more fluttering and filtered piano samples going over its deeper bass lines. There's even 2 tracks with vocal guests. Between the 2, I definitely prefer the female guest vocalist Fears on the track Honesty. Her voice ends up getting treated more as a trip-hop-ish texture to add to the airy atmosphere of low-key, jazzy piano loops, compared to the male guest Jade, who appears on the track That Object Spoke to Me, who is way more upfront in the mix and kind of delivers a standard mildly deep indie voice performance. He's fine, but isn't on one of my favorite cuts here. Also, to add to the whole radio theme of the concept, there's a number of interludes such as the AM station scrubbing on Interior, the filtered and damaged piano recordings on Streetlight, or the humorously titled Please No More Ad Breaks, which sounds like it's about to go into a commercial break and stops itself with barely audible ambience. This isn't an album that exactly has a lot to it, or I feel like, again, is going to change anyone's life, but I have heard albums in the past that went for this blend of lo-fi house with mild jazz flares that ended up really boring and generic, and this does not feel like one of those cases. While absolutely nothing too ambitious, it's definitely an all-around pleasant listen that I can tell Costa had his heart put into and succeeded on all the fronts it was going for. It sunk me into his mood quite effectively without ever running together or overstaying its welcome. A charming little project for what it is, so if all of this sounds interesting to you, give it a shot. Overall feeling a 7.5 out of 10 on it. Next up from Nemo Kama, Loverboy. Okay, next up we got the latest project from Lara Rex Martin, aka Mimo Kama. This isn't my first time covering their work. Back in the Volume 7 roundup, I covered her last album, Neon Genesis Soul into Matter Squared, which was an extremely unique experimental release that combined a lot of different influences and inspirations I'd never heard come together before, from Jewish mysticism to science fiction anime, although definitely resulting in a listen to which I had a lot more respect from a distance than I got a lot of personal enjoyment out of. Although any feelings I had on that project are pretty much entirely irrelevant when it comes to this latest outing, which sounds absolutely nothing like that last one, ditching much of the experimental and ambient flares in favor of a much more straightforwardly accessible 90s jungle breakbeat sound. I feel like I'd seen it get a fair bit more positive buzz than the last one, and you know what, I can see why. Even if its approach to this genre may not be all that unique, this is a very easy project to like and get into. All the standard breakbeats go as predictably hard as you'd expect through nearly every track, definitely hitting on a bit of an old A Guy Called Gerald Black Secret Technology type of vibe, albeit better polished mastering-wise. Also carrying a similar melancholy and atmospheric undercurrent beneath all the bangers. Some tracks do lean into the playfulness of the 90s rave era it's chasing after, like the squirting synths of the title track, the joyous melodic builds of Bubble Bag, or the off-kilter Herbie Hancock samples on The Rush. But there's also a lot of tracks which feel much more laid back and dreamlike in their approach, not just seen on a track like Cloudscape, which lives up to its title, and I think samples the same opera performance that Orbital sampled on Belfast. Always the kind of nod I can get behind. But also cuts like Lone Heath and Whitehawk, which feature a lot of the same ingredients like the enveloping synth pads and delicate vocal samples, albeit presenting them through a markedly darker and more brooding lens, even further explored through cuts like Andro, whose mix of airy pads and metallic clanking melodies going over its stabbing breaks almost start to feel like a weird traffic jam that occurs in a dream and sees like cars melting into each other or something. Or a cut like EXP1, which takes a break from the breakbeats and instead delivers an atmospheric mix of brooding and rumbling bass synth ambience. Not to say every track is as alluring as the next, there's a number of interludes scattered throughout which seem to act more as transitional elements, and I do feel like a couple of tracks near the middle like Ignite or Kyle didn't really stick out to me as much as some of the above mentioned standouts. Although the album does flow remarkably well from start to finish and form a pretty coherent and satisfying arc that can alleviate some of these issues. If you're a fan of this kind of old-school jungle breakbeat material with that atmospheric backing, I'd say this project will definitely be worth your time to sit with. For what it is, it's very well made. I'm overall feeling a 7.5 out of 10 on it. Next up from AL Victor, Hi! Next up on the list of random Bandcamp Daily Recs, we got a German experimental artist who seen fit to make a bit of an interesting record out of strange, minimal modular synth excursions and manipulations of light percussion, which seem to have a bit of an African influence. I opted to include this one in the roundup as it doesn't sound like any other projects I've heard lately, and I can't easily compare it to anything else. Although, I don't know if that always translated to as attention-grabbing a listen as I'd hoped. On one hand, the formless, bright, melodic plucks of Nylon being recontextualized into more rhythmic structures on Delicate were pretty cool. The more experimental bell textures creating a surreal mood on Fungus or being combined with melancholy guitars on Diving. The harsher and almost dubstep-esque electronic texture seen on Slingshot or any of the formless African-inspired rhythm and percussion manipulations on any of the Form tracks. Probably most interestingly explored on penultimate track Form P3114, which allows all its strange percussion outings to get more layered and complex and even take on a bit of a dubby texture. There are a lot of interesting out-of-the-box ideas here, and their juxtaposition still feels like it adds up to a cohesive vision. But at the same time, the project does feel oddly lifeless and emotionally barren throughout. These are pieces that try to sound interesting and maybe pique a bit of curiosity, but also don't really dig that deep. And they're really not that far out of the box to be off-putting or anything. And there are occasional cuts, especially the closer Form 4-1, which can lose my interest altogether, made for a particularly dragging and anticlimax finish to this thing. If all this stuff still sounds like it's interesting to you, it's probably worth a listen. I feel like this kind of stuff has its place and could find an audience, but I'm not really feeling it on any deeper level on that. I'm feeling like a 6.5 out of 10 on it. Next up from Bodiku, Tokyo. Sometimes, though, all you need is a little instrumental hip-hop in your life, so that was what drew me to pick up this album from Bodiku, or however you say that, sorry. A producer who is not from Japan, but was so inspired by all the visuals he'd seen of the city, sampling lots of city pop and J-pop and Japanese jazz and funk records with his MPC 1000 sampler. One of the only such samplers that happens to be located in his hometown of Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia. Yeah, Mongolian producer, wasn't expecting that, huh? Granted, the actual material on display here isn't anything revolutionary in the grander scheme of the genre. It's a pretty standard instrumental hip-hop record, but it is a very enjoyable one all the same that kept me well invested from start to finish. Highlights include the bright piano loops of the title track, the sparkling electric pianos on guest performance, preceded by an admittedly lengthy radio monologue that maybe didn't need to be there, but still the actual track was really nice. There's also the chopped up organs and guitars and synthplex on Night Drive, the heavier soundtrack bass lines and strings on Office Melancholia, the bright 80s synth going over the breakbeats on Subway, the lovely sparkling plex and chords on Reaching, and possibly, best of all, a mix of movie soundtrack strings wrapping around some soul harmonies and sitars on Sea Waves. And while not every cut here is as memorable as the next, a few like City Sadness could fall in the background too easily or feel a little too barren like Floating in the Clouds, or a little cheesy and cliched like See You in Tokyo. I wouldn't say there's any cuts here that truly fell flat for me. Every track on here does very well to set up that city at night vibe that he was going for and vividly captures that melancholic atmosphere. And sure, I may have heard plenty of instrumental hip-hop or vaporwave that also captures this vibe just as well, if not even better, but it still makes for a viscerally simple pleasure anyway. If it sounds like the kind of thing you'd be in the mood for, I definitely recommend giving it a spin. I'm overall feeling a 7.5 out of 10. Next up from Andrea, Dew in Color. Okay, Andrea, this is an artist signed to the Alien Tape label, alongside Ski Mask and Zinker Brothers and all those, and this is the second time I'm covering him. Back in the Volume 4 roundup, I covered this guy's debut album, Ritorno, and thought it was pretty good, even if it was very uneven with a mostly uninteresting first half and a way stronger second half. I haven't come back to it since covering it in that segment. The good news, however, is that this sophomore effort from him is a noticeable all-around improvement. First of all, he doesn't sound as similar to Ski Mask as he kinda did before. This album, while made out of a lot of the same ingredients, is clearly setting itself apart with a much brighter, sunnier, more organic, and more uplifting feel. I almost get a feeling listening to this that I do to some certain early period Ultimate Records releases. Even includes a lot of nice little jazz influences scattered throughout, which is a nice touch. Andrea is really starting to carve out his own niche in this scene. But more importantly, compared to Ritorno, which kinda sat in the background until like really waking up for the last 5 tracks, Due in Color feels fully awake from the beginning. And even though I was waiting for some track to come along and maybe disappoint me or lose my attention, that weak spot never came. 12 tracks and no misses this time around. The closest we came was maybe the ambient closer track, Return Lay, and possibly the looped, maybe rapper samples going over the oily pads on Zephyr. And even those were quite good. All the other tracks could be marked as highlights and maybe even could be a candidate for the best track here. From the breezy and open-sounding pads leading into jazzy percussion on Haim, Audi's, or Chess Bio, the latter's an especially epic highlight, to the triumphant atmospheric breakbeat workouts of Res, Remote Working, and Silent Now, the latter has some particularly satisfying bass lines. There's also the much more muted and experimental, almost reverse-sounding beats of Lush and End drum version, the liquid ambience of Dove Mai featuring some very distant horn samples, or the fuzzy breaks and moody pianos on Hazy Mo and Am Dur, which add up to some particular emotional highlights. Again, I suppose it remains to be seen how much long-term staying power this album will have. I did detect a slight bit of running together in the first half, and I don't absolutely love every track, but I do at least really like all of them. The jump in consistency between his first album and this one is legit impressive. I expected to like this album, but I didn't expect it to be this good. I may have to hang on to it. Definitely check it out. I'm overall feeling a solid 8 out of 10 on it. Next up from Andrew Rayel, Lifeline. Well, I felt like I ought to also have a bit of commercial trance in my diet, so here we go with a new release I saw nearly topping the iTunes dance charts one day and decided on a whim to throw it in here. I had heard of Andrew Rayel before. While I never listened to a full album of his solo material, he did collab with ATB once on the track Connected a few years back, and that was the last time ATB put out a track that I thought was properly great. I wasn't going into this expecting my mind to be blown, but I thought, hey, if he's got the tunes in production to back himself up, then hopefully this should be a fully pleasant, turn your brain off kind of listen. And, well, I guess it kinda was. I think Rayel has the production part down on this project, but I don't really know about the tunes. This album is very generic, and the tunes on here can sometimes be painfully basic even by commercial trance standards. Now, to his credit, Rayel himself is never the problem with any of these cuts. He does give all of them the right spacious production you'd want, though he is too often undercut by either a chord progression and or a melody being way too generic or run-of-the-mill. A lot of 4 chords of pop cuts here and tracks which are just complete bags of nothing, such as Shades or River. Or more often the cuts can be killed by their vocal guests, which can range from anonymous to distractingly cheesy. See the track Shine Like You if you want the worst possible example. I did not like the vocal performance on that one at all, and that track's overblown drop was not helping either. But there are still a handful of solid tracks scattered throughout that I ended up getting into anyway. Closer had a pretty solid melancholy and atmospheric feel to it, and some of the best melodies. Silver Lining went for more of a 90s house approach that I thought was really charming. Sleepwalking had a pretty sick drop with lots of blaring synths. Tracks like Stars Collide and I Wish allowed Rayel to get his Paul Van Dyke on, or at least his Ferry Corsten on a little bit, with a lot more propulsive trance grooves pushing them forward than most of these tracks had. And of course I'd be remiss if I didn't mention From This Day On, which has Jess Breeden on it. I'm automatically happy to hear her voice on a track again, and the track itself is nice too, with a little bit of a quirky drop that I think is kind of nice. Tracks like these are good, but it's a little hard to recommend the album for 6 or 7 pretty good tracks when the full project is 18 tracks and all of the remaining cuts are either completely interchangeable or even a little annoying in a few isolated cases. I've definitely heard far worse commercial trance projects than this before. I'm glad to have at least come out of it with some material of value, and the rest was pleasant enough while I just had it on in the background. But I'd be lying if I said any of this was really anything so special you need to go out of your way for either. It merely just gets away with falling into the decent category. Enough for me to let it off with a solid 6 out of 10. Could have been a lot worse, but also could have been a lot better. Next up from Mick Chillage, Temporal Cities. It has been a long time since I've attempted to get into a project from Michael Gainford, aka Mick Chillage. I know this guy best from being one half of the ambient outfit Autumn of Communion alongside Lee Norris, but he has an equally sizable back catalog in his own right, as Norris does. Truth be told, his catalog is so vast that I find it very difficult to keep up with. He releases tons of new albums all the time. Way back in the Volume 2 roundup, I sat through a 3-hour demo mix he put together out of most of his old releases from 2009 up through 2019 when it released. Itself a tie-in with a 25 CD box set outlining most of his history. But his catalog may have already near doubled in size just in the time since that compilation dropped 4 years ago. The guy releases so much music, and already this project he put out in mid-February is not his most recent output. I think he just put out a new album this morning, the day I recorded this. But hey, I saw it show up in my emails one day thanks to being on the Autumn of Communion mailing list. I thought the album cover looked cool, and I decided to throw it in here on a whim. And while this isn't anything I wouldn't have already expected, this is a pretty cool release all the same that lives up to that futuristic looking cover. The core of the album is 3 very lengthy tracks, which are mostly meandering and improvisational ambient pieces. Because, of course. But they kept my attention pretty well. The 29-minute title track, which is ostensibly split up into 2 parts, hits you with lots of reverb-soaked buzzing and squelching synths, which have a particularly dark and foreboding quality to them, and occasionally a little bit of like a Blade Runner-y feel. At least in its first half, before bleeding into a much more refreshing second half, with lots of bleeping synth arpeggios and clattering 90s artificial intelligence-esque beatwork. Hypnotize is the lowest key of the 3 tracks, featuring nothing but warm and evocative soothing pads for most of its running time, aside from a stretch from like the 13-minute mark to the 20-minute mark that features some minimal tapping percussion. And the comparatively brief 15-minute Oblique Horizons goes for the darkest mix of all 3 cuts, starting out with some well-enveloping but slightly menacing pads, and eventually paying off with some much thicker 80s industrial percussion later on. That one's pretty fun. And he also includes 2 bonus tracks, which are just alternate, entirely ambient takes of the other tracks here. They're not essential to the experience, if you ask me. But yeah, while this isn't exactly the most mind-blowing of ambient material, and as I think will be the case with pretty much anything Mick Gillett releases, it's probably not going to be for everyone. But all I bargained for was some futuristic vibes to have on in the background and sink myself into, and he very much delivered on that front. So yeah, if this kind of music is your cup of tea, I'd say it's worth giving a shot. I can give it a 7.5 out of 10. Next up from 3070, Art Make Love. And last on the list of random Bandcamp Daily Recs for this roundup, I wanted to add in something a little different and picked up this really nice little electronic neo-soul jazz project from this 8-piece outfit based in Melbourne. It's still definitely a project that falls under the electronic umbrella. There's lots of liquid bubbling synths through every track, including a handful of quick interludes that just let the synths out all on their own. And in spite of all the much more organic textures, from the straightforward soul singing to the deep electric bass lines and saxophones and woodwinds and all that, all of it does still add up to something that carries a distinctly plastic-y electronic aesthetic, and I do mean plastic-y in a good way. And it is exactly as much of an effortless feel-good listen as you'd expect it to be. The lead vocals of Alicia Joy are consistently excellent and have a lot of soul and passion put into them. The tunes are mildly catchy, and the way all these sounds, textures, and melodies blend together is super easy to sink myself into and create one particularly immaculate vibe. If there's any issues I have with the project, I suppose it doesn't actually give me much to say beyond that, or much I can analyze or break down in terms of individual tracks. Even if the tracks are able to stand distinct from each other thanks to their actual tunes, if I attempt to describe what went into them, I feel like I'd have the exact same things to say about each one. The ideas on display didn't wear out their welcome, but there wasn't exactly a wide variety of them. I did also feel like the album did sag a little bit near the end. While I think all the full tracks from the opener Without You Within Me through Love Is Waiting are really strong, as is the closer Holy Roller, there's also a stretch of tracks from J-Love through You Better Run where the hooks aren't quite as memorable and the album just fell in the background. But still, even with these issues in mind, this was definitely a unique sounding project that effortlessly brightened up my afternoon anytime I put it on, and for that I'd definitely recommend giving it a shot for anyone interested. I'm feeling a strong 7.3 out of 10 on it. Next up from Wevel, Remember. Next up, I guess it's time for me to give another chance to Wevel, the decently well-acclaimed indie electronic duo from the Netherlands. I never really had as strong feeling on these guys' previous work as I think I wanted to. I thought their self-titled debut was pretty solid around the time it came out and decently stood out from the scene with its mix of low-key UK garage revivalism with a bit of indie pop influence. Although, while I still generally think it's good, I don't think it stands out quite as much from the crowd by today's standards as it might have in 2016. And their second album, The Wait, in 2019, I think I covered in the first volume of Some Stuff I Missed, and distinctly remember thinking it was painfully mediocre and anonymous aside from the track Someday, and being so bored by it to the point of barely being able to make it through the whole thing. Still, this third album of theirs felt like it was seeing a decent bit more acclaim and attention, with a number of people calling it their best work yet, so I threw it in here out of curiosity. And you know what, even if I'm not exactly in love with this either, I do at least feel like I get the hype behind it. The sound they explore here, while very much in line with what they were doing before, does at least have a distinct enough flavor this time where I feel like they can call it their own. The particular mix of blocky and fuzzy synth textures and mildly falsetto-y indie vocals may not be that striking in the bigger scheme of things, and that particular indie vocal delivery, which is focused on through most of this album, has never been my thing. They tend to serve to make these mixes feel more generic for me, but at least it feels like Wevel have carved out their own recognizable niche within these styles. And while I do think the results are a bit scattershot, with a handful of tracks like Losing Days or Where It All Leads that left little to no impression on me, or in the case of the former including some kinda unpleasant vocal processing, I think it's at least a good sign that, in contrast to their last two projects to where I could point to like one single track on each, which was way more memorable on it than everything else, this one has a whole bunch of different highlights that I could mess with about equally. Be it the brighter build-up into a solid disco groove on the title track, cuts like Don't Lose Time and Day After Day that were able to nail down some solidly propulsive and danceable grooves that I found particularly striking, or cuts like Change for the Better and Forever, which pull me in with their particularly strong tunes. These tracks were really good. Even some of the middle tier cuts on here, like Everything Went Well and Never Stay for Love, are pretty enjoyable for what they are. Do quite like the funkier electric bass texture on the former of those. Is this an album I see myself keeping around longer term or coming back too much in the future? Not really, but you know what? I respect it and can still give it my recommendation. I definitely get why this one has been resonating more strongly with people, and if this kind of sound is your thing, then I think it'll be worth a shot. I'll give it a solid 7 out of 10. Next up from Kinoteki, Dawn of the Final Hour. So here we have the latest album from New York producer Kinoteki. I saw this project getting some buzz both from fellow YouTube critics and in some other circles around me and was intrigued by it. Even more so when I saw that Kelvin had a feature on this album, since I really liked that guy's EFYL album in 2021. They're label mates on Tabula Rasa Records, and they even made a whole project together last year, which I missed entirely. Either way, this sounded like it was going to be right up my alley. I was pretty hyped to hear this off the initial previews I heard, and yeah, it turns out this album's great. Shooting around through all sorts of different styles in electronic music, between IDM and drum and bass and juke and footwork and ambient and garage and house and seemingly everything in between, all adding up to a particularly bombastic and epic but also very easily accessible listen that always makes sure to focus on the core grooves and melodies over, say, the flashiness of the sound design. Now, while the wide variety of sounds and styles on display here is one of the album's greatest assets, and probably the aspect that will most likely lead to it getting more replay value for me later on, I will admit it can lead to the experience feeling a bit scattered and not the most cohesive. There's not really a strong through line between the 11 tracks on this thing, and there are definitely some tracks that didn't resonate with me as strongly as others. See some tracks that utilize processed vocals, such as My Broken Heart or 67 Alps You Don't Understand, that could get a tiny bit grating in some parts despite some solid enough tunes. There's a quick ambient interlude that didn't really add much in Come Back I Miss You, or especially the track Helium Dreams, which had a theoretically compelling mix of skittering drum machines, side-chained organ-like leads, and yelpy, airy male vocal samples making for a solid hook. But the entire mix felt very messy and unstable, and like it could fall apart in any moment in a way that I don't think really complemented what the track was going for. It's like trying to dance while holding a Jenga tower. But these tracks are still perfectly fine, and I can't complain too much about this stuff when there's so many highlights, with some of them hitting the heights that they do. Like how the album starts out ridiculously strong with the almost title track Dawn of the Final Day, and its mix of banging acoustic drums and bright melodies bleeding into hard-hitting breakcore in its second half, followed by the bright EDM stabs and super visceral classic house rhythms on MasterCard with Visor. Two tracks that sound so completely different from each other, but both kind of knock my socks off in their own separate ways. There's also the catchy melodic acid house and polished vocal chops of In My Mind Radio War Dub. mildly funereal but epic atmospheric drum and bass of How to Fall Out of Love Again and Again, the steadily building footwork-oriented Third Strike with its mixes of rapper samples and vocal chops going over sharp drum machines and sinister ambience, or the much more uplifting, happy, and dreamlike mix of chopped-up vocal samples with expansive ambient pads on Ecstasy and Limbo. But the track I think I was most looking forward to hearing was obviously the 9-minute closer in collaboration with Kelvin, the concisely titled The Whisper and You, I Know, Make It, The Final Act. And boy did that one live up to my expectations for it, going for an especially slow-building and dramatic mix that starts out sounding like a cleaner and more polished EDM-ish take on like a Burial-inspired style of UK garage beats and a repetitive vocal chop, but very subtly increasing in tempo over time and ending in rollicking bass arpeggios, acid synths, jungle breakbeats, thundering techno kicks, and more. God damn does that one go off and make for an epic finish to this thing. Don't really know what else to say about this album. I may have my minor issues with it and can find it to be a bit uneven occasionally, but it's just as much of a consistently exciting, well-varied, and well-polished listen as I saw it purported to be. I can definitely see myself hanging out of this one, or even making a spot for it on the year-end list. Definitely make sure to check it out. I'm overall feeling an 8.3 out of 10 on it. And finally, from Andreas Vollenweider, Slow Flow and Dancer. Whoops, it looks like we're not done with 2022 quite yet. To close out this roundup, I felt like it was only fitting for me to shout out this new album, or double EP maybe, from one of my all-time favorite artists, the Swiss harpist and new age composer Andreas Vollenweider. This dropped back in October, and I completely missed it until someone pointed out to me that it existed like a month ago. Initially, I wasn't sure if I was going to review it since his last album from 2020, Quiet Places, which I covered in its own video without scoring it, hasn't really stuck with me outside of having given me a quick excuse to shout him out. But I thought, what the heck, I'll just throw him in here anyway, because I inherently love his music on a baseline level. I may have excluded him from my format in years previous due to my not considering him electronic music, but I kind of want to include him in my format anyway, because, I mean, who else is going to cover him? And compared to Quiet Places, which felt more like a quick, low-stakes side project to keep him occupied during the pandemic, this project feels markedly more well-realized and like a proper comeback for him. And ironically, I feel like this album might be the closest Vollenweider's ever come to electronic music. I heard markedly more synths and drum machines and other synthetic elements on this album than I'm used to out of him. Which is obviously not a complaint for me. I would get it if some found the incorporation of synths into this project to maybe feel a bit cheesy for their liking, but I think they're implemented very well, mixing quite seamlessly into all the usual well-varied organic instrumentation you'd expect from him. And obviously, as you can tell from the title, this project is split up into two halves. The first half, Slow Flow, is kind of more him focusing on the traditional sound we all know him for, centered around his harp with some very nice and warm string orchestra accompaniment. But despite being called Slow Flow, the material on display isn't actually that slow. It's very inviting and uplifting and happy sounding. Especially when it comes to tracks like As We Sail On By and Deep Green Waltz, which feel rather celebratory and have a little bit of bounce in their step. Though there are plenty of tracks that do end up on the slower side and make for particular emotional heavy hitters, such as Forever Now and Find Me in My Dream, and all these cuts in the first half do in fact have a delicately flowing quality to them. Much of this half of this project feels like getting a warm hug from a family member you trust. The second half, Dancer, is unsurprisingly much livelier and more energetic, but the most striking thing about it is how he utilizes the African a cappella group, fittingly called Africapella. He has included African singers and elements like these in his music before. A couple of tracks on his 1997 album Cryptos spring to mind. And much of this stretch of the project kind of reminds me of those moments. But they're just as well utilized here as they were on that album, and he even incorporates more jazz elements into these tracks as well. Like how the track Whoa Whoa flies between the African singers and sections focus on pianos and trumpet solos. Or Scarabaeus, which where these flashy, almost Mexican sounding horn sections join the a cappella singing, which is filtered through a vocoder and make for a particular stomping cut. And of course he has time for a couple of tracks without the African vocals, but still fit with the theming, be it the wide open and soaring orchestral accompaniment behind The Golden Bird, or the breezy synths and fast-paced drumming on the closer Up and Out. This entire album is just lovely from start to finish, in exactly the way I'd want out of a new Vollenweider project. And while I obviously don't think it reaches his biggest heights in the 80s, it's at least the most I've enjoyed an album from him since Cosmopoly from 1999, or maybe even Cryptos, though it's definitely not better than the latter. That album explored a lot of similar ideas even deeper, and there's no cut here, which hits me on the level of a track of his, like, Trigon. Still, this was great. I'm very happy to have picked this up and gone back to it, even if I was a little late. Vollenweider's music always makes me feel nice to such an extent that no other artists are capable of, and this is one of the most joyous releases he's ever put out. I would definitely recommend picking it up if you missed it. I'm feeling a solid 8 out of 10 on it. And that's gonna be it for this roundup. But of course, this is all just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.